My golden sister received everything in our parents' inheritance for being a miracle child. Now that same miracle child kicked them out and sold their house to go live in New York. But when she couldn't manage her expenses, she came back demanding I give her my house because she deserves it. For as long as I can remember, there was always a difference in my house, something no one ever said aloud, but that was palpable in every gesture, every decision, every silence from my parents. I grew up knowing I wasn't the favorite. Not because they treated me badly, not because they left me without food or clothes, but because everything, absolutely everything, was done with another person in mind. My sister Emily, the miracle child, the shining jewel who had come to complete the family after a series of losses my mother experienced as divine punishments. She was born prematurely, against all odds, and survived after spending weeks connected to machines, surrounded by doctors, prayers, and promises to change forever if she managed to pull through. And she did. So, from that day on, her existence became a kind of sacred altar that we all had to care for, adore, and uphold, as if the simple act of breathing beside her was a privilege we couldn't question. While I managed to do my homework alone so as not to bother anyone, to endure fevers understanding that her birthday party needed inflatables, a makeup artist, and a magic show, and that mine was fine with frozen pizza and a crooked candle, Emily grew up receiving absolutely everything she asked for. If she cried, the solution arrived immediately. If something broke, it wasn't her fault. If she wanted something, my father said she had earned it because she had suffered so much. Once, when I was 12, I asked for a used bicycle I saw at the church flea market. They told me we had to save. 3 weeks later, Emily appeared with a new iPad because she had earned it with her grades, while I had been using a prehistoric cell phone for years that would turn off if I made more than 2 calls in a row. And so the years went by, an accumulation of small wounds that one swallows because that's how it is, because in a house like mine, complaining about those things was being envious. When I turned 18, I went to study in another state, not because I wanted to be far away, but because I needed to learn to breathe on my own. And it was the best thing I could have done. I worked my butt off part-time while studying, slept on friends' couches, shared rooms with guys who smelled of sweat and stale potatoes, skipped meals, and learned to manage numbers so my money would last. At 26, I managed to buy a small house, one of those with old foundations and a bathroom that creaks every time you shower, but it was mine. It took me years of sweat, uncomfortable calls with the bank, endless paperwork, and giving up any luxury to achieve it. It wasn't big or elegant, but it had an entrance that led directly to a bright kitchen, and above all, it had a key that hung from my keychain and belonged to no one else. While I lived like that, Emily became a walking billboard for privilege. My parents paid for her private college in New York, rented her a loft, bought her an electric car because she was more sensitive to the environment. And when she said she wanted to drop everything to become an influencer, my mother called me, almost crying with excitement, saying Emily was born to inspire the world. I hung up without saying anything. I didn't have the energy to debate that kind of idiocy. In her world of filters and liquid diets, Emily began to amass followers. Brands sponsored her with boxes of products she showed off as if they were gold, and she said in her stories that she was a simple girl who had made it on her own. On her own, as if there weren't parents behind her paying rent, student loans, beauty treatments, and gifting her every opportunity, while I had to cook rice and eggs 3 times a week to pay for car insurance. When our parents sold the family home to move to a retirement center in Florida, I knew nothing until the transaction was already done. One day, my mother called and told me I no longer needed to come clean the garden on Sunday because there was a new owner. That's how I found out. The house we grew up in had been sold without consulting me at all. She said they didn't want me to feel pressured and that Emily had taken care of everything because she has more aesthetic sense for choosing buyers. When I asked them what they did with the money, my father replied that part had gone to cover their entry into the retirement center, and the rest they had left to Emily because she had expansion plans for her life project and needed it more than I did. I'm not exaggerating. Those were his exact words, that I didn't need it because, as always, they assumed I would manage, that I could, that I already knew how to survive. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't complain. By then, I had swallowed that feeling of being Plan B so many times that I learned to digest it without nausea. I wished them luck and hung up. I focused on my work, on continuing to pay for my house, on living without owing anyone anything. Until one day, without warning, without a prior message, without a single sign, Emily appeared at my door with 3 suitcases a designer handbag, and a Yumi everything look on her face. She said she was coming to spend a few weeks, that the apartment in Brooklyn was a rip-off, that the city was a trap, that life there was designed for people with at least 3 fixed incomes or a lifelong inheritance. She told me this as if she herself hadn't sold everything she could to move there, as if she hadn't bragged for years about being a woman of the world. The most impressive thing was how she said it, that this house, my house, really belonged to everyone. And since I didn't have a partner or children, I didn't need so much space. And then, without a shred of shame, she added that the family had always thought that sooner or later I would end up selling it for something more my size. At that moment, I understood that there were no limits. That for her, for my parents, and for that family image they built around her, I was the drawer where old things were kept, the net that supported the rest, the guy who never complains and therefore can carry everything. But that day, I promised myself that this story wasn't going to end like all the previous ones. This time, I wasn't going to stay silent. This time, I wasn't going to swallow the humiliation and pretend nothing was happening. This time, for the first time in my life, I was going to play by their rules, and I was going to show them that I am not the spare brother. This time, if they wanted a war, they were going to get it. Update 1. A week went by without any sign of her, and honestly, I began to think she had gotten the message. I had clung to that foolish illusion that, for once, after so many years of privileges and absurd decisions, Emily would have hit reality and would be learning to fend for herself. But like everything in this story, that peace was temporary. One Saturday morning, just as I was planning to sit down for a quiet breakfast for the first time all week, I heard the doorbell. Peeking through the window and seeing the car parked out front, I knew instantly something was wrong. Not because Emily was alone. This time, she didn't come alone. She was with our parents, one on each side, as if they were her personal lawyers, dressed in those Sunday clothes my mother only wore when she wanted to appear composed. The moment I crossed the threshold and opened the door, I knew they weren't visiting. They were on a damn mission. My father was the first to speak, with that tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, but only managed to sound condescending. He said he knew all this had been a misunderstanding, that Emily had felt rejected, and that as a family, we should try to heal the wounds before they grew too large. My mother interrupted him with that brittle voice she had perfected over the years whenever anyone touched on the subject of Emily, and she told me bluntly that her daughter was going through an extremely difficult time, that she had been the victim of a scam with an apartment without a legal contract, and that her debts were beginning to affect them too. When I asked what she meant by affecting them, she lowered her head. It was Emily who answered, and with the dramatic tone of a community theater actress, she blurted out that she had had to use an additional credit card in Mom's name, just for a few months, to cover a couple of expenses while waiting for an important collaboration to deposit funds. According to her, it was something temporary, with no ill intentions, a simple banking misunderstanding that was being exaggerated. It was then I noticed the tremor in my mother's hands. It wasn't just from shame, it was because she knew what was coming. What they didn't know was that I was already aware. A friend of mine who works at a local credit union had warned me weeks before that my mother's credit history had strange movements. Without telling him I suspected Emily, I asked him to show me some statements, and indeed, there were senseless charges, designer clothes purchases, supplements, plane tickets, hotel reservations, even a transfer to an account in New York with my sister's name as the beneficiary. I didn't say anything at the time. I wanted clear proof before confronting her. And now I had it. I stood up without a word, went to my desk, took out the folder where I kept everything, and put it on the dining room table. I opened the pages one by one and slid them in front of my mother. I told her to look at the amounts, the dates, the places. I pointed out the cash withdrawals that coincided with the days Emily had posted stories traveling to Palm Springs. My mother couldn't hold my gaze. My father crossed his arms, clearly feeling betrayed, not by me, but by his miracle child. Emily stood up abruptly, knocking her chair, and blurted out that it was an invasion of privacy, that I had no right to pry into her personal movements, that I was a meddler with a savior complex. But by then, she had no one on her side. My parents remained silent, and what bothered me most was that it wasn't a silence of indignation. It was that ashamed silence that only appears when someone finally realizes they've raised a person they don't recognize. I told her to leave. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the door in her face. I just stood in front of her, watching as she clumsily gathered her things. She was leaving without even apologizing. As she left, she uttered one last phrase, one that made it clear to me that this wasn't over. Someday you'll understand that this house wasn't yours to begin with. I closed the door without responding. My mother stayed in the living room for a while, trying to gather the words she had never had to say to me. Finally, she managed, her voice barely audible, that they didn't know how they had allowed Emily to become that. My father, who wasn't one for many words, just muttered that he hoped this wouldn't get any bigger. I let them stay for dinner. I served them in silence and didn't want to bring up the subject again. But in my head, everything was already decided. If Emily thought this was going to be resolved with more emotional blackmail, she was about to discover that she no longer had that power over me. This time, I wasn't going to back down. This time, there was no turning back. Update 2. A little over 3 weeks had passed since that last visit when the mailman left a yellow envelope in my mailbox, my name handwritten, no return address, but with handwriting that seemed damn familiar from the first moment. Opening it, I found what at first glance appeared to be a makeshift contract, a mediation document drafted with just enough formality to try to seem professional, but so poorly structured that not even a first-semester law student would have taken it seriously. It stated that I, as the older member of the nucleus, without family burdens, committed to ceding my property to my sister Emily in exchange for an informal promise of moral compensation and future financial retribution from our common parents. All this was written as if we were in a damn TV novel, with bombastic phrases that had no legal weight, but made it very clear what she still thought, that this house wasn't mine, that it was just a temporary loan that should be returned when she needed it. Accompanying this mess of a document was a more personal note, handwritten by Emily, where she tried to sound conciliatory but couldn't help letting her usual passive-aggressive tone slip through. She said she understood that times had been difficult for me, that she knew I was proud and solitary, but that I should learn to share with the family. In that same note, she informed me that if I didn't agree to the agreement, she would have to tell the rest of the family and the community that I was a selfish man who refused to help his own parents in a critical moment. Basically, she was attempting emotional blackmail poorly disguised as family negotiation, as if she didn't know I had already endured years of that cheap manipulation and that this time I wasn't going to swallow a single word without spitting it back with rage. What Emily didn't know was that since the last incident, I had started documenting everything. Every call, every visit, every attempt to approach was backed up with recordings, screenshots, emails, and witnesses. So, the first thing I did was call my lawyer, not to ask if I could ignore the paper, because I already knew that, but to ask how far I could take this without getting myself into trouble. I told him about the letter, the attempted fraud with my mother's credit cards, the veiled threats to defame me. I sent him the scanned documents, passed him the audio recordings I had, and asked him to tell me clearly what tools I had to protect myself legally before Emily decided to climb another step on her ladder of madness. His response was direct. He recommended I file for a restraining order for harassment and attempted family fraud. He said it wasn't common, but with the evidence I had, the court could take me very seriously. He suggested I act before she did. That same afternoon, I filed the application at the county courthouse. I brought printed copies of everything necessary and had to sit for over 2 hours with a social worker who took my testimony with a mixture of disbelief and secondhand pity. The hardest part wasn't remembering the facts, but putting them into words without sounding exaggerated, because when you've lived years of subtle manipulation, of contempt camouflaged as concern, of emotional violence disguised as good manners, it's hard to translate that into terms a judge can understand. But I did it. With every word, I felt years of frustration accumulating. In the end, the social worker looked at me with a serene expression and told me I was doing the right thing, not for revenge, but for mental health. She noted everything down and gave me the date for the preliminary hearing. It would be in 15 days. The following days were not peaceful. Emily didn't stay quiet. She started sending messages to mutual friends, saying I had completely shut down, that I was acting like a stranger, that maybe I needed help. Some who already knew the story forwarded me the texts without a word. Others, the more naive or idiotic ones, wrote to me asking if I was okay, if I needed to talk. The only thing I did was block or ignore them. I didn't have the energy to keep explaining to the world that I wasn't the problem, that I had simply stopped playing the role of silent support she expected. Comments also appeared on social media, indirect remarks disguised as reflections, phrases like, "Sometimes blood doesn't guarantee love," or, "When one gives everything, All that's left is to walk away. The typical poetics that guilty people use to victimize themselves without telling the truth. But the worst came 3 days before the hearing. Emily showed up at my house again. This time, she didn't ring the doorbell. She stood in front of the garage with her phone in her hand, recording a live video where she talked about how some siblings preferred money to family, and how the system always protected the coldest one. I realized this because of the notifications that started arriving in the family Facebook group, where one of my aunts commented, "What a shame to see them like this." I left the house with my phone already recording, pointed it directly at her face, and told her I had a court order in process and that everything she was doing was sufficient proof to aggravate the complaint. When she noticed I was also recording her, she stopped the broadcast and shouted that I couldn't talk to her like that she just wanted to fix things. I replied, without losing my tone, that if she really wanted to fix something, she would have started by paying what she owed, by apologizing to our parents, and by stopping behaving like a damn victim when in reality, she was a professional parasite. She left with her eyes blazing with rage, but without saying another word. She knew she had crossed a line, and what she didn't know yet was that this line already had legal consequences. That night, I slept with the blinds closed, the phone on silent mode, and a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't fear. It was something like peace, a cold, conscious peace that came from knowing that this time I wasn't going to let her get away with it. This time, I wasn't going to back down. This time, she was going to know my limits. And the worst thing for someone like Emily was knowing that she could no longer manipulate me as before, because I no longer saw her as my sister. I saw her for what she was, a threat. And I was not going to let her screw up my life again. Update 3. The hearing arrived faster than I expected, though that didn't mean I felt entirely prepared. No matter how much you mentally prepare, no matter how much you practice in front of the mirror or rehearse what you're going to say with your lawyer, as if it were a play, standing in a courtroom to tell how your own sister has become an emotional, legal, and financial threat is not easy at all. Because it's not just about saying what happened, but about facing what all of that means. That your family broke down years ago, that nobody wanted to see it, that you were raised to endure, and that now, finally, you're saying enough. The day I had to appear at the county courthouse, I woke up with no appetite, a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away with coffee or toast. I put on the same blue shirt I wore when I signed the mortgage for my house, as if somehow that would remind me why I was there. When I arrived at the courthouse, Emily was already in the waiting room. She was alone, dressed in a white outfit that looked like it was taken from a civil wedding catalog, and with makeup that tried to show vulnerability, but actually made her look like a caricature of herself. There was no trace of our parents, nor of any lawyer. Nobody sat next to her. I don't know if she couldn't find someone to defend her, or if she simply assumed she could manipulate the judge as she always manipulated everyone. As soon as she saw me, she straightened up in her seat and looked at me as if I were the aggressor, as if everything that was happening was a horrible injustice against her. My lawyer told me not to make eye contact. I just sat down and waited for my turn, trying not to explode every time I heard her voice talking to the court staff as if she were a victim of domestic violence. When we were called, the room was practically empty. It was just the two of us, the judge, a records assistant, and a security officer in the corner. The judge was an older man, one of those who has seen too much in his career to be swayed by tears or smiles. He began by reading the summary of the case, then gave me the floor. My lawyer had already submitted all the documentation, so I just had to state the facts verbally. I spoke calmly, each word heavy with years of accumulation. I explained how Emily had used my mother's name to open accounts, how she had tried to coerce me with a false document, how she had harassed me in my own home, and even defamed me publicly on social media. We played the audio recordings where it was clearly heard how she insulted our parents and talked about breaking me emotionally until I gave in. The judge just raised an eyebrow and took notes. When it was her turn, the show began. Emily brought her hand to her chest as if she were in a 90s soap opera and began to cry, saying that I had always been cold, that since childhood I treated her with contempt, that she had felt forced to do what she did because she never found support from me. She said she was a young woman who had gone through difficult times in a tough city, that her only intention had been to get closer to her brother to rebuild the family. What impressed me most wasn't what she said, but how she said it. Each word was laden with an artificial sweetness that would have fooled anyone who didn't know what was behind it. But the judge did know. He had the documents, the audios, the emails. He had the truth in his hands, and apparently, He was already tired of the performance. After she finished her statement, the judge remained silent for several seconds. Then he leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said that in his opinion, there was no doubt that Emily's behavior had crossed unacceptable limits. He said what worried him most wasn't the money or the accounts, not even the attempt to appropriate property, but the constant pattern of emotional manipulation and veiled threats that were clearly documented. He issued an immediate restraining order for 12 months, extendable to 18 if another infraction occurred. He also ordered that the local prosecutor's office be notified to evaluate whether it was appropriate to initiate an investigation for forgery and fraud, especially for the misuse of my mother's identity. I just nodded. I didn't feel relief or satisfaction or that kind of poetic justice one imagines in these types of scenes. I just felt a brutal emptiness, as if what I had known for years but no one wanted to admit had finally been said aloud. Emily left the courtroom as if she had been shot in the soul. She said nothing, didn't turn around, just walked with her eyes fixed on the floor as her world of lies crumbled a little more. I stayed for a while talking to the lawyer. He recommended I maintain my distance and document any new contact attempt instantly. He warned me not to let my guard down, because people like Emily rarely accepted defeat without fighting again. And he was right. In the parking lot, while I was putting the papers in the glove compartment, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was her. It said, "I hate you. You always wanted to be an only child." I read it once, without replying. I left it there as a reminder that the war wasn't over, but that this time I had the weapons, and she had nowhere to hide. I returned home that night with my head full of noise, but with something I had never felt with my sister, a deep sense of control. As if, finally, after a lifetime living in her shadow, I had found a way to make her stop. Not because she listened to me, but because for the first time, someone with power had told her that enough was enough. Update 4. More than a year had passed since that hearing when I received an envelope with a judicial letterhead in the mail. Instead of causing the classic knot in my throat, it made me frown with a mixture of boredom and resignation. Because when you have a sister like Emily, you learn that calm never lasts long enough, and that any prolonged silence is usually the prelude to another of her brilliant ideas, disguised as personal injustice. I opened the envelope with steady hands, already used to dealing with this kind of thing, and found a civil notification. Emily was suing me. But this time, the reason surpassed anything I could have imagined, even knowing she lived in a bubble of egocentrism and denial. The lawsuit was for emotional distress, defamation, and loss of potential income derived from her professional activity on social media, accompanied by a ridiculous figure, $75,000. It didn't take me a minute to understand that what she was doing was nothing more than her legal version of a tantrum. I called my lawyer immediately, and when I read him the concept of the lawsuit over the phone, he let out a laugh that ended in a tired sigh. He asked me to scan everything and send it to him, and by the next day, we were sitting in his office outlining the strategy. The first thing we did was collect absolutely everything that could disprove the supposed damage my sister claimed to have suffered. We went into her social media, downloaded screenshots of her posts after the hearing, and gathered videos where she continued to portray herself as a victim to her audience, talking about healing processes, while promoting supplements and wellness courses she sold for over $200 each. The irony was unbearable. According to her, she had lost her reputation because of me, but meanwhile, she continued to gain followers, do collaborations, and sell the same image as always, the fragile but empowered girl who had survived a narcissistic and cold brother. In addition to that, we tracked down 2 of her former roommates from New York who had made public posts years ago accusing her of not paying rent, selling common apartment items, lying about her financial situation to avoid signing contracts, and scamming them with a venture that consisted of selling energy healing kits with colored stones bought on Amazon. My lawyer contacted both, and although one refused to get involved for fear of reprisals, the other agreed to testify. She was a high school teacher who had to cover the rent payments alone for 2 months because Emily had disappeared with excuses about a spiritual emergency. We also obtained a screenshot of a conversation in which Emily mocked my mother for giving her her card without supervision and said that, when one is born a queen, the world has to pay for it. We didn't have to exaggerate anything. Her own arrogance was enough to show the judge that this lawsuit was as absurd as it was unfounded. When the day of the civil trial arrived, she appeared with a new lawyer, younger and more ambitious, one of those who accept any case just to get exposure. The guy had the nerve to smile before entering the courtroom, as if this were a fair fight and not the desperate attempt of a woman to continue squeezing what was no longer within her reach. The hearing was long, uncomfortable, with moments when I had to restrain myself from exploding. Her lawyer argued that my statements before the previous judge and my smear campaigns on social media had caused a significant drop in her ability to generate income, that her mental health had been affected by the negative exposure, and that I had benefited financially by taking away her safe space. When it was my turn to speak, I held nothing back. I said, in no uncertain terms, that the only emotional damage had been suffered by my mother when she discovered her daughter had used her name to get into debt, that the only damage to reputation had been caused by her own actions, recorded, documented, and backed by witnesses. We replayed the audios, presented the screenshots, the testimonies, the movements of her public accounts. The judge this time was a woman in her 50s, with a sharp gaze and zero tolerance for nonsense. When she finished reviewing all the material, and Emily was still crying in a rehearsed manner, the judge interrupted her without the slightest compassion and asked if she really thought the court couldn't distinguish between a legitimate victim and someone who was simply looking for a way to blame others for her professional failure. It was one of the few times I saw Emily speechless. She said nothing, just sat there with her mouth agape, waiting for an escape that never came. The ruling was clear, direct, and with no possibility of appeal. The lawsuit was dismissed. She was ordered to pay court costs, and a financial penalty equivalent to 10% of the amount she requested was authorized, as it was considered a frivolous lawsuit. That meant she had to pay my lawyer's fees plus a penalty of $7,500. And as if that weren't enough, the judge ordered the FDA to be notified due to the complaints surrounding the products she sold on her website without sanitary registration. That afternoon, while having coffee in the same place I usually go when I need mental space, I received another message from her. A short one, a sentence spat out more than written. Congratulations. You ruined me. I read it once and deleted it. I didn't even share it with my lawyer. I was no longer interested in responding. By then, I had stopped seeing her as a sister. She had become an alien figure, almost like a poorly drawn caricature of what could have been a decent person, but who chose to become a time bomb. The only thing I did that night was save all the trial material in a special folder on my computer with the date and the scanned ruling. Not to relive it, but to have it on hand if she tried anything again. Because if that hearing had taught me anything, it was that with Emily, you could never let your guard down. She didn't understand the word no. She only understood consequences. And from now on, every time she tried to screw me over, she was going to get exactly that: real, legal, and unavoidable consequences. Final update. 18 months later, when I finally thought all that was behind me, that Emily's definitive silence was an indication she had finally learned her lesson, I woke up one ordinary Sunday to a notice on my door that sent me back to hell with a single piece of paper taped on. It was a preventive lien document, issued by a bank I had never set foot in, with my address handwritten, and a warning that there was an unpaid loan of over $25,000, supposedly guaranteed by my house property. I stared at it for several minutes, as if struggling to process that after everything that had happened, after a restraining order, a failed civil lawsuit, an open federal investigation, Emily still had the nerve, or the absolute lack of common sense, to try something like this again. But she had. And this time, she had taken it to a level that was no longer just audacious or illegal. It was directly criminal. The entire morning was spent in frantic calls to my lawyer, the property registry, the bank that issued the supposed credit, and my insurer. Each conversation revealed a new layer of stupidity. Apparently, Emily had forged a document with a supposed authorization from me, including a poorly imitated signature that resembled a cheap graffiti as much as a legitimate notarized signature, and had presented an altered copy of the property title where she figured as a co-owner of the house. The most surreal thing is that the bank had processed the credit without a thorough verification, trusting that the attached title was sufficient collateral. A minimal review by my lawyer was enough to confirm that the document was full of technical errors, digital editing marks, and a non-existent notary. But that didn't stop the lien request from being active in the system. My lawyer, who was as fed up with all this as I was, showed up at the courthouse on Monday morning with an emergency motion. In 3 days, he managed to get the judge to cancel the lien order, instruct the bank to rectify its process, and open a new criminal case for document forgery, bank fraud, and identity theft. Emily was arrested that same Friday in Philadelphia. just as she was trying to open an account under a false name using a temporary ID card that didn't match her social security number. She was detained on the spot and offered no resistance, at least not physically. But according to the prosecutor, she spewed an endless list of ridiculous excuses about how she only wanted to recover what belonged to her, and that the house was hers by emotional right. The level of delusion was so great that the prosecutor requested a preliminary psychological evaluation, though not as a defense, but to ensure she wouldn't try to use it as a strategy to evade trial. A few days after her arrest, I received an unexpected call from my parents. This time, not to ask for explanations or to try to soften what their favorite daughter had done. It was simply to ask me for help, but not for Emily, for themselves. It turns out that after years of denying reality, after defending her even when there was nothing left to defend, my parents were finally facing the financial consequences of their decisions. They had sold their apartment in Florida to cover part of the debts Emily left in their name. But what they didn't know was that she had also signed an online loan using my father's data, which began to be automatically debited from his retirement account. They were homeless, without liquid cash, and with a mountain of collection letters. For the first time in my entire life, my mother cried in front of me, not for something that had happened to Emily, but for something Emily had done to them. She said she didn't know who they had raised, that she didn't understand at what point her daughter had become that person. I said nothing. It wasn't necessary. The damage was already done. I wasn't cruel. I didn't reject them, but I didn't throw open the door either. I told them they could temporarily move into a small apartment I rent out through a real estate agency, that I would cover their first year, and that I would hire a financial advisor to help them reorganize what little they had left. I made it clear that there would be no more bailouts, no loans, no indulgences. Not for revenge, but because after so much time ignoring what was happening, it was time for them to understand what it meant to live with real limits. They accepted. They accepted without protest. I suppose they finally understood that they no longer had power over me, that the son they had demanded endure, yield, and understand had grown up enough to stop saving them from themselves. Emily was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with no possibility of reduction, and to pay a cumulative fine exceeding $20,000, in addition to the obligation to compensate for the damages in my parents' name. As I understand it, she is serving her sentence in a county jail, without visitors, without stable work within the prison, and with the respect of absolutely no one. There are no followers to save you when you're in an orange uniform, sweeping corridors, and receiving the same 3 bland meals as everyone else. Her social media accounts were suspended for fraudulent activity, her accounts frozen by court order, and her assets seized to try to cover a minimal fraction of what she owes. I have everything documented, every receipt, every sentence, every letter signed by a judge that supports what no one wanted to see before, that I was right. Today, my house is still mine. Every corner reminds me that I didn't get here by luck or whim, but because I broke my back working and learned not to let anyone steal what was mine. And sometimes, when I sit in the living room with my dog asleep at my feet and the peace of mind knowing I no longer have anyone breathing down my neck, waiting for me to fail so they can claim my space, I realize that my greatest revenge wasn't seeing her fall. It was forcing her to live with the consequences of every single one of her decisions, without excuses, without bailouts, without family to save her. Because unlike her, I learned to be responsible. And now, she is learning, the hard way and in silence. What happens when you build your whole life believing the world owes you something? And the worst part for her is that nobody listens to her anymore, not even those who once called her a miracle child. Subscribe for more daily stories.